Hey guys, tonight we descend into the muffled, breathless world of a WWII bomb shelter. You're not a soldier. You're not a politician. You're just you, a regular, breathing, panicking human caught in the middle of history's most dramatic fireworks show. And as the wail of the siren yanks you from sleep again, you begin your morning jog not toward breakfast, but toward survival. The good news, you're alive. The bad news, so are dozens of strangers who are about to become your roommates. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? Drop your city and local time in the comments. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're mid-toast, half-dressed, and mid-sentence when the siren starts. That sound of screeching banshee halfway between a scream and a whistle activates your muscle memory like caffeine never could. Everything drops. You're already out the door with your gas mask bag banging against your leg. It's not bravery. It's routine. Down the crumbling stairwell, across cracked pavement, past the blackout curtained windows. You don't speak. No one does. You just move toward the shelter. There are two kinds of shelters. One is the fancy one, the reinforced basements under department stores, or converted underground stations like the London Tube, packed with civilians lying like sardines. The other kind, yours, the communal, city-dug pit beneath an old housing block. Brick walls, tin roof, damp air thick with old coal dust and the echo of past sirens. You get there just in time to wedge yourself inside. The steel door groans as it closes behind you. From this point forward, you are no longer a person. You are a unit in the great wartime math problem known as how many people can survive in 400 square feet of underground darkness without murdering each other. You find your patch of concrete or your plank of wood or, if you're late, your vertical standing space. Someone's dog is already barking. A child is crying. There's the muffled thud of someone else banging on the outside door. Late. Everyone flinches. No one moves. And then you hear it, far off, like someone slamming cupboards across the sky, the first distant blast. Life above ground is postponed. Welcome to the shelter. Your morning ritual now involves whispering, sitting still, and pretending your feet aren't freezing. A tin can heater in the corner throws out enough heat to warm one toe. If you're lucky, you might be tempted to complain, but remember, complaining is already being done loudly by the man 2 seats over, who claims this is all a conspiracy by the Ministry of Fuel. You're good. Mainstream historians agree the air raid siren was a psychological tool as much as a warning system, designed to create urgency. It also created panic even in those who heard it daily. Fringe diary entries describe children who began to giggle at sirens out of nervous habit, while one noted woman in Leeds claimed she slept better underground, as long as no one sang. You sit. You wait. Minutes pass like hours. You try to read, but the dim, flickering bulb above you has a personality on again. Off again. Mostly off. Someone coughs violently, covering their mouth with a rag. You pull your coat tighter. Eventually. Silence. The all clear hasn't sounded yet, so you sit some more. You try not to think about the ceiling above you and how many stories lie between you and the world. But you do. Every second. Historians still argue whether staying in shelters for long periods did more harm than good for civilian morale. You, however, are not a historian. You're just someone sitting on a bag of potatoes, hoping the roof doesn't fall in. You don't really sleep in a bomb shelter. You sort of shut down, like an exhausted phone on low battery. You lean against a cold pipe or lie curled up on a borrowed wool blanket that smells like damp biscuit. You close your eyes and drift somewhere between dozing and hypervigilance, always one cough away from full-blown alert. The shelter hums with soft breathing, occasional muttering, and the unmistakable sound of someone chewing something rubbery at 3 a.m. You want to ask what it is. You decide it's better not to know. Morning comes not with sunlight, but with the subtle change in smell, fresh sweat layered on yesterday's. Someone opens a tin of condensed milk with a rusty key crank. It's a communal victory. You didn't die overnight. You're still in the shelter. And so is the guy who snores like sandpaper on stone. Let's talk bedding. It doesn't exist, unless you brought it. And even then, bedding means an army surplus blanket or your coat folded into a semi-pillow. You try to find a spot away from the toilet bucket and not directly under the vent that drips whenever someone upstairs forgets to turn off a tap. Spoiler, that's every night. Your body is not a fan of this new lifestyle. Your lower back feels like it's auditioning for a historic reenactment of chronic pain. You stretch your legs and realize the pins and needles in your foot have unionized and are staging a protest. Most shelters were not designed for comfort. They were designed to not collapse. Success. That's about all you can say. The air is a moist cocktail of dust, breath, mildew, and whatever food someone tried to reheat over a paraffin stove. Historians still argue whether urban shelters were more psychologically damaging than the bombings themselves. You wouldn't be shocked if the answer was yes. You shuffle over to the communal corner where someone has brewed tea using what might generously be described as water adjacent. It's warm. That's enough. You drink it slowly, savoring the illusion of civility. Privacy. That's a luxury item. You undress by rolling under your coat. You relieve yourself behind a hanging bedsheet. And if someone farts, we all pretend we didn't hear it. The unspoken code of shelter diplomacy: silence, denial, and forgiveness. You're technically safe, but your heart still races every time you hear distant booms like angry giants cracking their knuckles overhead. You can't tell if it's near or far, falling or fading, so you wait, eyes on the concrete ceiling, listening, always listening. Sometimes, if things are quiet enough, someone tries to boost morale with a song. Usually it's "We'll Meet Again" or "White Cliffs of Dover" in a shaky alto that makes you feel both comforted and on the edge of tears. It's either beautiful or unbearable. Possibly both. Quirky fact time: some shelters, especially in London's more affluent neighborhoods, installed pianos underground for sing-alongs. Meanwhile, others had rats, leaky pipes, and only one working flashlight passed between 30 people. The dichotomy of war, an impromptu concert 5 feet away from a puddle that may or may not be urine. You look around at your fellow humans, old women holding rosaries, kids trading marbles, a man scribbling in a journal. You wonder what they're writing. You wonder what you'd write. But all you can think of is how long it's been since you last saw a real bed, with sheets and a pillow that didn't smell like fear. By the time the all-clear sounds an anticlimactic rising tone, you're half asleep. No cheers, just slow movement, quiet packing. Everyone shuffles back toward daylight, blinking like mole rats, coughing, yawning, and pretending we slept. Back to life. Until next time. You feel it before you smell it, which is saying something. The creeping pressure in your abdomen. The dull alarm bell that no amount of pretending can ignore. It's time to use the toilet. Except this isn't a toilet. It's a bucket. A real, standard issue, open top. Metal bucket with a wobbly wooden seat and a curtain that only exists in theory. Congratulations. You're about to experience one of the least glamorous aspects of surviving in a WWII bomb shelter communal elimination. If you're lucky, someone's hung a blanket between 2 bunk frames for a semblance of privacy. If you're less lucky, it's just tucked in behind a structural beam, slightly behind a pile of empty tin cans, surrounded by deeply understanding strangers pretending they can't hear anything. Toilet time is not private time. It's a performance of willpower, dignity, and rapid exit strategy. This part of your survival experience is lovingly known as the chemical assault zone, and while there's no gas attack involved, you'd be forgiven for wondering, Shelter sanitation was a war within the war. In official shelters, a government-issued Elson chemical toilet might be provided, which is essentially a glorified bucket with blue sludge inside. In reality, though metal pails with newspaper lining and prayers for solid outcomes. One mainstream historical fact in heavily bombed areas like London's East End, authorities distributed sanitation kits consisting of a bucket, some disinfectant powder, and very vague instructions. The rest, trial and error, mostly error. Fringe tidbit in one famous shelter under a pub. People actually formed a line to relieve themselves in the landlord's beer cask. Allegedly. It still had a better smell than the actual lavatory. And you wonder why no one talks about this in school history books. There is no flushing. Obviously. What you do is this: cover the contents with shredded newspaper. Maybe add some coal ash if you've got it a top-tier deodorizer in wartime logic. And then seal the lid. If you're on rota duty. You get to carry it out to the designated waste disposal point once the all-clear rings. The bucket sloshes. It always sloshes. Every step feels like a test of both muscle control and spiritual fortitude. Some shelters have a second, even more cursed. Night pail, a smaller vessel for, quick deposits. These are usually kept under bunk beds. That's right, your pillow is exactly 2 feet above someone else's bladder. Historians still argue whether people in rural shelters, who had outhouses or trenches outside, fared better or worse than urbanites who had to do everything indoors. You suppose the answer depends on how much you enjoy sprinting outside during an air raid while holding your pants and praying for invisibility. Wartime propaganda didn't exactly show this part. No glamorous posters of women heroically emptying pee buckets into alley drains. But it was part of life, every single day. The smell was permanent. It soaked into the wood, into the blankets, into your very soul. Toilet paper. Don't make us laugh. There was none. You use whatever's available: newspaper, ration cards, yesterday's list of blackout instructions. It's not just a sanitation issue, it's an exfoliation event. And you pray no one sees your face when you stand up grimacing. Class differences. Oh yes, in some upper-class private shelters, people installed actual flushing toilets, but only if they were above the sewer line. During bombings, the city's plumbing backed up like a cursed fountain. Guess what happens when a shockwave hits a pipe full of gas and sewage? That's right. Reverse geyser. There's a reason many people considered indoor plumbing more dangerous than useful during the Blitz. So you've done your business. You've sealed the bucket. You emerge with a nod of grim accomplishment. Maybe someone pats your shoulder in solidarity. Maybe someone avoids eye contact. We're all in this together, yet profoundly alone. And tomorrow, you get to do it all again. The rest was filled in with tinned goods, powdered milk, and a frankly insulting amount of cabbage. Fresh meat luxury. Sugar rarer than forgiveness in Monopoly. Here in the shelter, food is pooled and shared, everyone contributing their weekly ration items. That sounds noble in theory. In practice, it turns into a communal pot of things that should not be combined: carrots, condensed milk, sardines, and OXO cubes, boiled into something called victory stew. You eat it. You do not ask questions. You pretend it's delicious. You lie to yourself with every bite. The bread is an experience, officially called the national loaf. It's grayish, dense, and universally hated. Imagine biting into a brick of moist cardboard. Now imagine that brick having a sense of betrayal. It's supposedly nutritious, but that depends on how you define nutrition and whether you believe sawdust counts as fiber. You sit cross-legged on your cot, eyeing the tin can in your lap like it's just challenged you to a duel. There's no label. There never is. Wartime meals are less about flavor and more about suspense. What's inside today's canned Spam peas? A mysterious gray mass that looks like cat food and tastes like disappointment. Welcome to dinner in a WWII bomb shelter. You don't choose the food chooses you. And sometimes, it chooses to be terrifying. Let's set expectations. This is not a feast. This is survival, rationed, measured, and occasionally wriggling. You've got a dented tin, a crust of bread so dry it could be classified as a weapon. And maybe if fortune smiles upon you, a sliver of cheese that smells like foot and dreams. Your daily caloric intake is dictated by ration books. One mainstream historical fact: by 1942, a typical adult in Britain was entitled to just 1 egg per week, 2 ounces of butter, and about 4 ounces of bacon. Fringe tidbit people got so creative with their cooking that wartime cookbooks included recipes for mock goose made from lentils and apples, and Woolton pie, a pastryless pile of boiled vegetables named after the food minister. Historians still argue whether this was an act of culinary resilience or a government-sanctioned prank. You don't drink water. You'd think you could, but the tap water in shelters often tasted like rust, concrete, and pipe dreams. So you drink tea, endless tea. Tea made from water boiled over a tiny kerosene stove, served lukewarm in a chipped enamel mug. It's more ceremony than refreshment, but it keeps you sane, sometimes, if someone's really lucky. They'll have saved a tin of evaporated milk or condensed cocoa. These become instant shelter celebrities. Sharing them is an act of social diplomacy akin to royal patronage. Refusing to share them, however, is social suicide. You'll be known as that guy who hoarded the milk for eternity. Hunger is constant. Not starvation, you're eating enough to stay alive, but a gnawing emptiness that never quite leaves. You dream of roast dinners. You hallucinate potatoes. You begin to suspect that the guy across from you smells like gravy. He doesn't. That's just your brain crying. Mealtimes are oddly ceremonial. Someone clangs a spoon against a tin to announce the feast. People line up with mismatched mugs and plates, and there's a hush of anticipation as the ladle dips into the pot. It's not excitement. It's hope. Faint, ridiculous hope that maybe this time the stew won't taste like betrayal. And dessert, you must be joking. The closest thing to dessert is a slice of raw carrot with a smear of margarine. It's crunchy, vaguely orange, and tastes like the concept of sadness. Sometimes, people sing to distract from the chewing, or they tell stories about meals they once had: roast lamb, lemon pudding, fresh baked bread. The way their eyes glaze over, it's less memory and more religious experience. You listen, smile politely, and quietly chew your way through the rest of the can. You're full, but not really. You've eaten, but you're not satisfied. And that's dinner in a bomb shelter, enough to keep you going. Never enough to make you feel whole. You tug at your shirt, and it resists. Not because it's tight, heaven knows you haven't eaten enough for that, but because the fabric has the texture of old rope dipped in ash. This is your daily outfit. Your only outfit. And it smells like panic, sweat, and 8 other people's stress. In the bomb shelter, fashion is not a priority, nor is comfort, nor is basic hygiene. If we're being honest, you wear what you have, and what you have is a thin, scratchy, wool blend uniform or whatever survived the last laundry day before the war started making laundry impossible. Let's start with the obvious. It's cold, especially at night. You wear layers, and by layers, we mean everything you own: a shirt over a vest, under a sweater, inside a coat that might once have been someone else's. The coat is heavy. The wool is coarse. It smells faintly of mildew and fear. Washing your clothes, hilarious. There's no plumbing, no detergent, and no space. You might rinse a sock in a puddle or wipe your shirt with a damp rag if you're feeling optimistic. But mostly, you wear your clothes until they become more memory than fabric. Then you keep wearing them. Mainstream historical fact during World War II. Clothing was rationed just like food. In Britain, people received clothing coupons about 66 per year, which meant you had to choose between, say, a pair of trousers or a new coat, replacing worn-out items. Only if you gave up something else, which explains why darning, patching, and reusing were high art forms. Underwear if you have it. Congratulations. If you have 2 pairs. You're royalty. Changing clothes becomes a calendar-worthy event. You start ranking garments by how much they itch instead of how they look. That sock less itchy than the other one. Victory. Your shoes, if they can still be called that, are relics. The soles are cracked. The laces are improvised. You've stuffed newspaper inside to stop the drafts. And walking in them feels like you're being gently tortured by ghosts with a grudge. But they work, sort of. And that's the only requirement in war. Fringe tidbit, some people wore shoes made from compressed paper or old tires during the war. They didn't last long. But hey, neither did optimism. Let's talk parasites. You're itchy. Constantly. Lice are a fact of life. And they're thriving in this warm, tightly packed environment. Fleas, too. You've been bitten in places you didn't know had blood. Your scalp tingles. Your sleeves move suspiciously. You scratch. You stop scratching. You cry a little. Then you scratch again. There's a delousing station, sure, but it's a joke. A quick blast of powder that smells like regret and lasts 15 minutes. Historians still argue whether delousing in shelters had any real impact, or whether it was simply a morale-boosting placebo. Blankets. You mean that one damp rectangle you huddle under? It's more spiritual comfort than physical. It smells like other people and feels like wet hay. You wrap yourself in it anyway, because freezing is worse than sharing. You start noticing things like how people stop standing too close to you, or how the kid with the clean socks gets treated like a celebrity. You envy people with functional buttons. You dream of zippers. You fantasize about elastic. You develop irrational hatred for moths. Getting dressed each morning is like recommitting to suffering. You shake out your shirt, a few bugs drop out. You pull on your pants, damp in one leg. No idea why. You lace up your shoes, avoiding the hole in the toe. And you nod like, yep, ready to face another day of discomfort. One day, someone donates a bar of soap. It causes a minor riot. You don't win, but you get to sniff it. It smells like hope. You carry that scent in your imagination for the next week, inhaling deeply every time you feel the lice regrouping. Eventually, your clothes stop being something you notice. They become part of you, like your shadow or your pessimism. Just another piece of the puzzle that is surviving in a bomb shelter. You feel it before you taste it. That dull, nagging throb somewhere near your molars. It's the kind of pain that starts small, like an annoying neighbor knocking on your skull, and then, without warning, kicks down the door and throws a rave in your gums. Congratulations. You've got a bomb shelter toothache, and you're about to discover a new definition of the word helpless. Dental hygiene in the shelter is, shall we say, more of a memory than a habit. You might still have a toothbrush if it didn't get lost during evacuation or broken from overuse. Toothpaste, huh? You wish. You might try brushing with salt, or baking soda, or a bitter herbal mix passed down from your grandmother's cousin's neighbor. But mostly, you do what everyone else does. You chew slowly, pray nothing cracks, and ignore the blood. Gum disease is just part of the aesthetic now. Your breath could strip wallpaper. Your tongue feels like it's been sandpapered. When you sleep, your teeth grind from stress. When you eat, you avoid one side of your mouth. Eventually, you start eating with your eyes closed like it'll somehow hurt less if you can't see it. Mainstream historical fact during WWII, dentists were scarce, especially for civilians. Military personnel had better access to care, but even then, tooth extractions were more common than fillings. Tools were rudimentary, and local anesthesia was hit or miss. If your tooth was bad, they just pulled it. No numbing, no mercy, no dentist jokes. So, you wait, and suffer, and listen to others talk about the good old days when they had floss. The pain makes you irritable. You snap at people, then you apologize, then you snap again. One day, someone offers you a clove, not a snack of spice. They tell you to bite down. It burns. But then, oddly, the pain fades. You start worshiping that clove. You name it. You guard it. You whisper to it. Fringe tidbit before modern dentistry. Cloves were used as natural anesthetics thanks to eugenol, an oil that numbs pain. It works. Kind of. For 5 minutes. Then the pain returns with backup. You try to distract yourself by cleaning your teeth with a rag, or massaging your gums, or asking someone to punch you in the arm, just so your brain has another pain to focus on. But that doesn't help. So you retreat into silence, holding your jaw and rocking gently like a tragic lullaby. One day, an older woman in the shelter says she used to be a nurse. You plead for help. She agrees if you're brave. You say yes before asking what it involves. She pulls out a pair of metal tongs that may once have been pliers and boils them in a tin pot. "Bite on this stick," she says. You obey. And then you discover that true courage has no sound, just muffled screams and the smell of burning wood. Historians still argue whether more people in shelters died from untreated infections than from actual bombings. What they don't debate is that once a dental issue started, it rarely ended well. The infection could spread into your jaw, your neck, even your brain. And in those tight, unsanitary quarters, all it took was one sneeze and a cracked molar to turn into a funeral. Of course, you don't have painkillers. You have cold compresses if there's water, or whiskey if someone smuggled it in. But mostly, you just deal, like everyone else. Teeth become survival tools, gnashing, grinding, resisting. They are your hidden agony, and everyone has one. Eventually, you get used to it, or maybe the nerve dies. Either way, the pain dulls. Not because it healed, just because your body has redefined what urgent means. The toothache is now background noise, like distant bombings, like snoring from the guy in the bunk beside you. You start dreaming of dentists, of reclining chairs and tiny mirrors, of the buzzing sound of salvation. But when you wake, it's just you and your splintered toothbrush and your rotting enamel. You gargle salt water and brace yourself for another day, because in this shelter, survival has nothing to do with strength and everything to do with enduring small, awful things one scream at a time. The alarm hasn't rung, because there are no clocks anymore, just instincts and habit and the dull rhythm of hunger. You roll off the cold slab of bedding and stretch, but your back protests. Another day of labor awaits. In theory, you're safe down here in this concrete crypt. In practice, survival still demands sweat. Work in a WWII bomb shelter isn't heroic. You're not decoding messages or plotting sabotage. You're keeping the shelter running barely. That means hauling buckets of waste up narrow corridors, chopping whatever roots were delivered last week, and trying to keep the only working hand pump from rusting shut. You also get to scrub mildew from the ceiling with vinegar and cloth, because even underground, mold refuses to be ignored. Mainstream historical fact in London's tube shelters during the Blitz. Civilians formed voluntary committees to distribute food, manage supplies, and maintain order. But even volunteer labor became compulsory when survival depended on cooperation. Work shifts were unglamorous, shoveling coal for heaters, ration organization, or acting as de facto janitors. The daily grind was both invisible and indispensable. You're handed a dented pail and told to fetch water again. The walk is short but humiliating. You squeeze past sleeping bodies. Try not to trip over someone's outstretched leg, and avoid stepping in whatever that puddle is. The pump groans as you twist the handle. It smells faintly of rust and resignation, and every drop is earned. You return to find your bunkmate has redecorated the shared space, which is to say, they've piled their belongings higher, and now you no longer have leg room. You don't say anything. It's not worth the argument. You just get to work, silently sorting damp laundry that hasn't dried in 3 days. Then it's your turn to help in the kitchen, or what passes for it. The kitchen is a shelf with cans, a single burner, and one pan that everyone's terrified to clean too hard, for fear it'll disintegrate. Today, you're making turnip mash, again, because variety is a wartime myth. You peel with a rusty knife and try not to think about how many people touched this handle before you. Then you stir, taste, and deliver spoonfuls to anyone too sick or frail to stand. You pretend not to notice that some people hide scraps under their blankets. You did it too, last week. Comic paradox comparison. Backbreaking work keeps you alive in the bomb shelter, but sitting still too long, that's how you mentally fall apart. Ironically, exhaustion becomes a coping mechanism, sometimes. Children are assigned watch duty, keeping an eye on candles, helping the elderly move about, or distracting others with songs. They treat it like a game. You envy them. You're 34, but in shelter years. That's middle-aged. Some kids are already acting like small adults, washing rags, pouring water for bandages, comforting younger siblings. Historians still argue whether these role reversals helped children adapt or stole their childhoods outright. There's no privacy, so every job is public. Washing clothes, brushing hair, even crying, it's all done in front of everyone. You learn to suppress emotion, to grunt instead of complain. You make a silent pact with your neighbors. We don't ask questions. We just survive. And every action becomes its own kind of labor. At night, you're sore in places you didn't know existed. Your shoulders throb from lifting. Your hands are cracked and stained. There's no lotion, no bandages to spare. You wrap them in torn fabric and sleep on your side, cradling your arms like glass. Fringe tidbit, some shelters tried to schedule rest periods, complete with music or books. But most gave up when fights broke out over who got to control the record player. You start to lose your sense of time. Workdays blend together. One task leads to another. You measure life in chores before bucket duty, after soup shift. You forget the names of weekdays. The calendar is now a menu of labor. Some tasks are so familiar they invade your dreams. You dream of scrubbing floors, of sweeping ashes, of boiling socks. The worst part, there's no finish line, no paycheck, no gold star. Just one more day where the ceiling didn't fall in, and the fire didn't find you. You whisper a thank you to nobody, roll onto your other side, and drift off knowing tomorrow will look just like today. And that's okay, because in here, sameness is safety, and safety, however exhausting, is a victory. You don't expect the weather to matter anymore. After all, you're buried under tons of soil and steel, but somehow it still finds you. Heat, cold, damp, dryness, each inescapable in its own way. Each a reminder that nature doesn't need permission to ruin your day. Summers in a bomb shelter are less seasonal change and more slow roasting. The air stands still, as if waiting to collapse. Sweat gathers before you've even opened your eyes. Your shirt, if you still bother to wear one, sticks like glue. You fan yourself with a piece of cardboard, but it's the equivalent of blowing into a volcano. Candles wilt, tempers fray. Even the rats seem sluggish. You consider sleeping closer to the stairwell, where there's at least a draft. But then you remember that's also where mold thrives, where it smells like wet bandages and feet, and where someone always coughs directly into the air. You stay put. Baking. Mainstream historical fact during the Blitz in London. Shelters often lacked ventilation. In deeper ones, like the tube stations, temperatures could soar, creating a breeding ground for respiratory illness. Authorities tried adding fans, but with no electricity, air circulation mostly meant waving a hat and praying for mercy. Winter, however, is a separate brand of cruelty. Not a cinematic snowflake and blanket type of winter. More like teeth rattling, nose freezing cold that clings to your bones. The concrete walls exhale frost. You wake up with your breath fogging the air. Someone's socks have frozen into a shape. You try to laugh. It comes out as a wheeze. There is no heating unless you count body heat. And nobody wants to cuddle after sweating through August. You pile on every scrap of cloth, including a towel that smells like onions, and pretend that being numb means being comfortable. A few candles offer light but no warmth. You stare at them the way castaways stare at ships. Historians still argue whether shelters should have been outfitted with better insulation from the start, but when bombs are falling, thermal efficiency gets bumped off the priority list. Comic paradox moment. The shelter is both oven and freezer. Too hot to think, too cold to move. You become a slow-cooked popsicle. Depending on the month, Your clothes make the problem worse. They aren't weatherproof. They're whatever you could grab when the sirens wailed that first night, probably a thin shirt, wool trousers, and maybe a coat with one working button. You haven't changed in weeks. The fabric holds onto moisture like a jealous ex, and don't even think about drying anything. It's either soaking wet or so stiff with cold, it could walk off on its own. You adapt by layering in ridiculous ways. Someone's baby blanket becomes your scarf. An old canvas sack becomes a shawl. You look like a scarecrow styled by despair. But it works, kind of. When it doesn't, you just pretend you're not shivering. It's easier than explaining that your toes haven't had blood circulation since Wednesday. Fringe tidbit in some shelters. Enterprising occupants tried lighting small fires in makeshift stoves for warmth. These were immediately banned after someone nearly smoked out an entire corridor. Then there's the damp. Oh, the damp. It's the one element that ignores season entirely. Summer or winter. It creeps through cracks, drips from ceilings, and saturates everything. Beds are moist. Shoes never dry. The walls sweat. You've seen fungi that should probably be classified and named. And the smell, it's like a stew of mildew, sweat, old food, and despair. You don't notice it anymore. But newcomers do. Their faces crumple. You feel oddly proud, like you've passed a sensory initiation. Comic aside, you could market this scent as Ode Underground. One whiff and your enemies would surrender. There's one rare joy when it rains outside. And you're safe down here. Thunder muffled by earth. No need to run. No umbrella to wrestle. Just you. Your mug of tepid water. And a faint smugness that, for once, nature's tantrum can't touch you. You hold on to that. But when it floods, oh, that smugness turns fast. Some shelters leak. Others become ponds. You rescue belongings, elevate your bedding with bricks, and try not to imagine your mattress floating away. You joke about turning the corridor into a swimming pool. No one laughs. Still, the weather becomes part of the rhythm. You brace for heat waves and dread frost. You measure time in sweat and shivers. Eventually, your body forgets what comfortable feels like. You become a creature of temperature adaptation, constantly negotiating with discomfort. But hey, at least it's consistent. The bombs above unpredictable, the weather down here miserable but reliable. And when everything else is chaos, that tiny bit of certainty can feel weirdly comforting. Water in the outside world. It's life. In here. It's a full-time occupation. You don't fetch water, you chase it. You negotiate for it. You even dream about it. Not in poetic, fountain of life kind of ways. More like warm, cloudy puddles and rusty spigots that gurgle instead of flow. Your shelter has a tap. Maybe, if you're in one of the luxury setups. But even that is more like a loose pipe. Weeping drops with the enthusiasm of a dying faucet. You line up with your tin mug. You wait your turn. You pretend that 5 mouthfuls is hydrating. It's not. Some shelters depend on delivery. Tanks rolled in by truck when the street above isn't a crater. The water arrives in drums that smell like oil and war. It's filtered, maybe. It's drinkable, allegedly. You gulp it down like it's champagne. Mainstream historical fact during the Blitz. British bomb shelters often struggled to maintain consistent water supply. Water tanks were rationed, and many shelter dwellers boiled water with portable stoves to kill bacteria, assuming they had fuel. But water isn't just for drinking. You have to wash yourself, the dishes, the floor that everyone walks on with boots that last saw soap during the last monarch's reign. Unfortunately, the water supply thinks personal hygiene is optional, so you ration it. 1 mug for brushing your teeth, 2 for cooking, a 3rd for wiping down your armpits with a cloth that once doubled as a handkerchief. Showers a myth, baths a medieval fantasy. You smell like you belong in a museum, one where everything is preserved in grime, fringe tidbit. Some shelter-goers resorted to catching rainwater with buckets placed at tunnel entrances. It wasn't safe, but it was wet, and that was enough. there's always someone who insists on boiling water just in case. They set up a little camping stove. It takes forever. The kettle screams like it's being tortured. The steam fogs the ceiling and everyone nearby. But at least it feels like civilization. For a minute, washing clothes. Not really a thing. You maybe rinse a pair of socks, then spend 4 days drying them over a candle. You rotate shirts, not for cleanliness, but for air drying purposes. If it smells less like feet than yesterday, you consider it laundry day. And then there's the dreaded flood, when water comes uninvited. Pipes burst. Toilets, the ones shared by 30 people, overflow. Rain seeps through the ceiling. Your shoes squelch. Your mattress turns into a sponge. Suddenly, the joke about turning the corridor into a swimming pool isn't so funny. Historians still argue whether early shelter designs adequately accounted for basic sanitation infrastructure. Spoiler: they didn't. Comic paradox moment. Water is both your savior and your saboteur. You beg for it, then curse it. You boil it, bottle it, guard it, and then mop it up by the bucket. You've started dreaming of bathtubs. Not golden age luxury tubs. Just any tub. One where you can sit without your knees in your face, with hot water, and a rubber duck. You don't even like ducks, but in the dream, you weep with joy when you squeeze it and it squeaks. Sometimes, someone proposes a group bath, a bucket party, where you all take turns splashing from the same pot. That idea dies quickly. Everyone would rather smell like death than see each other shirtless. And that brings us to the other danger disease. Waterborne illness is a thing. Diarrhea in a shelter. That's not just unpleasant, it's apocalyptic. One bad sip from a tin cup and the whole bunker becomes a gastrointestinal battlefield. You try to boil, you try to filter, but filters break. And boiling uses fuel, and fuel is more precious than your patience. So you take your chances. You drink slowly, nose pinched, and hope that this cup is just gross, not lethal. Open scholarly debate phrase, historians still argue whether makeshift water purification practices in WWII shelters were effective enough to prevent larger outbreaks, or whether luck and quick recoveries saved many from worse fates. You don't die of thirst, technically, but you do live in a constant state of not quite hydrated. Your lips crack, your head throbs, your pee is the color of regret. You start to think you were a fish in a past life and this is karma. But some nights, you manage a cup of warm, clean water. You sip it slowly. You let it linger. For one moment, it feels like luxury. You hold it in your mouth like wine. It's not wine, but your brain, desperate for comfort, pretends, and then someone farts, loudly. Everyone laughs. The moment passes. The cup is empty. The shelter returns to its natural state, damp, slightly smelly, and utterly unforgettable. You're still here, breathing under concrete, listening to the slow drip from the pipes and the deeper silence beyond. It's not comfortable, not even close, but your body has adjusted, in the way that all desperate things do, by lowering expectations, by redefining safe to mean simply not exploded. Around you, people are stirring less, snoring softly. The lantern burns lower. The rustle of blankets becomes the soundtrack of survival. Outside, bombs might still fall, or maybe the night is still for once. You won't know. You won't check. You'll stay cocooned in this shared, claustrophobic womb of brick and steel and body heat. The air is thick with sweat, with oil, with 1,000 micro-tragedies that make up each day. But it's also thick with resilience, with the quiet agreements between strangers to keep going, one rationed sip at a time. Your muscles ache, your eyelids droop. Even your fear feels tired now. It folds itself beside you like another blanket. No longer sharp, just heavy. And maybe, just maybe, you'll drift off before the next siren, before the next pipe leak, before someone starts snoring with their mouth open. Because here, in this stillness carved out from war, sleep is rebellion, sleep is survival, sleep is yours.
Now, we slip into the torchlit chaos of a Rajput courtyard, where jasmine flowers and clanging brass announce that love, if you can call it that, is about to be sealed in one of the most chaotic ceremonies you'll ever witness. The groom, poised and polished in ivory shawani, glances nervously at his feet. That's because he knows something you don't. His shoes are about to be abducted. You would never think that becoming family involves sneak attacks and footwear theft, but here, that's just foreplay for your in-laws. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. Let's see how far across the medieval map we can stretch. You're crouching now, hidden behind a decorated pillar, watching as a gang of giggling girls, most of them under 5 feet tall, armed with dupattas and dramatic flair, zero in on the groom's velvet slippers. These are not mere shoes. These are tokens of honor, of leverage, and more importantly, a bargaining chip to ransom later for sweets. Money, or on a very good day, actual gold. This is the juta chupai, the great Indian tradition of hide the groom's shoes. And yes, it predates modern prank wars by several centuries. The poor groom, meanwhile, is expected to keep a straight face. You, however, are free to laugh as he half sits, half lunges to protect his increasingly vulnerable footwear. But he can't do much. He's forbidden from reacting too aggressively. This is a wedding. After all, not a wrestling match. In return, the bride's side gets a free license to humiliate him with theatrical slaps, playful jabs, and a lecture or two from some strategically tipsy great-aunts. In many Rajput households, a full-scale tug-of-groom would break out, with older women on both sides mock-beating each other with rolled-up saris and threats of taking the food away. Historians still argue whether this ceremony had ritualistic roots, perhaps linked to ancient purification rites, where shoes were symbolic of worldly attachment, or if it was just a particularly festive brand of in-law hazing. What is certain is that the tradition underscores the social weight of extended family. You don't just marry a person, you marry everyone they've ever had chai with. Your opinion, by the way, is irrelevant. As the rituals continue, the groom is often led to the mandap wedding canopy barefoot, which is either sacred or slightly tragic, depending on your perspective. The marriage ceremony itself involves fire, Sanskrit chanting, and enough garlands to open a florist franchise. But the real event happens just after the vows. That's when the girls who stole the shoes appear like victorious pirates, demanding a ransom before the poor man can put them back on. Sometimes he's ready with a pouch of coins. Other times, he tries negotiation promises of silk scarves, perfume, or mangoes. In one recorded tale from a 13th century Rajputana wedding, the bride's cousins held out for 2 camels and a set of silver bangles. The groom paid. You don't argue with teenage girls in coordinated nose rings. The sensory overload is deliberate. The chanting, the flower petals, the smells of turmeric and rosewater, all blur together while the bride, demurely silent, is probably the only one actually enjoying the chaos. She knows this ritual is her clan's playful way of establishing power. You're not just marrying into a household, you're marrying into a system where diplomacy is measured in footwear. And if you're lucky, they might give the shoes back before the honeymoon. You trudge through a snow-swept Icelandic path, wondering if this is still technically a wedding or some kind of endurance test. A slate-grey sky presses down on turf-roofed halls, and somewhere beneath your fur-lined cloak, your knees are debating a formal strike. The groom, who looks like he's rehearsing for Ragnarok rather than matrimony, is visibly sweating partly from nerves, mostly from the fermented licorice liquor he was strongly encouraged to drink at breakfast. In medieval Iceland, cold feet are not just an idiom. They are an occupational hazard. Inside the longhouse, torchlight flickers off wooden beams blackened with soot and sagas. The smell is a pungent cocktail of sheep, fish, unwashed relatives, and anxiety. Weddings here are family mergers, not romantic declarations. Think less rom-com. More Cold War summit. You sip something dark, bitter, and terrifying, which everyone cheerfully calls Brennivin. Though it tastes like fire and sadness, the groom's task: get through it without vomiting, crying, or accidentally marrying the wrong cousin. Medieval Icelandic marriages often functioned as strategic alliances between chieftain families. The saga records are filled with arrangements brokered over dried fish and the occasional duel. One scholar notes that matches were sealed like contracts, complete with witnesses and property inventories. But not all unions were coldly transactional sometimes. Young love snuck in like frost under a doorframe. Historians still argue whether affection was part of the original deal or simply a bonus if nobody died before the first snowfall. Before the vows, there's a curious ritual where the bride and groom exchange items of symbolic weight. He might offer a sword, nothing says romance like a weapon, while she hands over keys to her household chest, signaling shared control. In reality, though, shared control tends to skew toward whoever owns the livestock. Dowries weren't always in gold goats, cheese wheels, and portable furniture often did the job just fine. Practicality reigned. If your new spouse could knit socks and haul fish, you were basically royalty. And then comes the sitting feast where everyone gathers around low tables to eat smoked lamb, sip sour ale, and loudly pretend to enjoy each other's company. Your job, as a guest, is to toast every speech, guess at every riddle, and not fall asleep in your bowl. It's part storytelling contest, part drinking game, and part group therapy session with more axes. The bride, meanwhile, is expected to show modesty bordering on invisibility. Her face may be veiled, her voice unheard, but don't be fooled. She probably helped organize the seating chart and is silently judging your drinking form. Now comes the moment that's equal parts dramatic and slightly criminal: the groom's retrieval. Sometimes symbolic, sometimes shockingly literal. The groom is taken from his home and brought to the bride's dwelling by her male relatives. In some tales, this resembled an abduction. In others, it looked more like a group hike with overtones of peer pressure. Either way, you're handed a drinking horn, told to smile, and reminded that resisting could mean losing sheep. By nightfall, vows are whispered beside a hearth. No priest, just an elder or respected speaker who can recite lore and legend in equal measure. The ceremony ends not with a kiss, but with a shared blanket and a prayer the roof doesn't collapse under the snow. You fall asleep listening to sagas about frost giants, your feet numb, your head buzzing with licorice fumes. Some scholars suggest that these rituals preserved independence in a society always one storm away from disaster. Others think it was just how Icelanders made the best of 4 hours of daylight and a serious shortage of entertainment. Either way, congratulations, you're married. Now go feed the goats. You're sprinting through a field in your best tunic. A full-grown woman bouncing upside down across your back like a sack of flour. And no one seems concerned. Welcome to a wedding day in medieval Finland or Estonia, where your marital worth is measured not by poetry or passion, but by whether you can carry your bride without falling into a puddle. There are no violins. Just mud, sweat, and a very real chance of dropping your future wife in front of 300 people. This is Yukon Kanto, or wife carrying, though back then, it wasn't always a friendly contest. The tradition may have originated from actual bride kidnapping, which sounds romantic if you ignore the part where it's technically abduction. Some stories suggest that grooms had to steal their brides from neighboring villages to prove their manliness and possibly their stamina. The woman was often in on it, of course, but the spectacle remained. Historians still argue whether this was a parody of past raids or a thinly veiled tribute to them. Either way, consent was eventually folded in. Mostly. The method of carrying varied. There's the fireman's carry, the piggyback, and the absolutely unhinged Estonian style upside down, over the groom's shoulders, legs hooked over his neck, with her face dangerously close to his lower back. A true test of core strength and bladder control. The bride, for her part, was expected to look elegant or at least not scream. One misstep and both of you hit the dirt, which is bad luck, not to mention a guaranteed roast from every wedding guest for the next decade. After the glorious wobble race concludes, you move on to something equally emotional. Public weeping. But not from the bride, no. She's holding it together like a champ. It's the groom who collapses into tears. In parts of medieval Finland, the crying groom tradition was meant to show sincerity and softness. That's right, masculinity, in its most primal, fur-lined form, included sobbing into your ceremonial beer. And if you didn't cry, well, clearly, you weren't taking your vows seriously, or worse, you weren't scared enough. The wedding feasts themselves were usually held in large communal barns or, occasionally, outside, because nothing says love like shivering while eating boiled reindeer. Dishes ranged from dense rye bread to mushroom soup so thick it could be used as insulation. If you were lucky, someone brought honey beer. If you were very lucky, someone had bathed recently. The music was loud, the dancing slightly dangerous, and the conversations all revolved around who tripped in the bog and whether the dowry included a cow with both eyes. One fringe tidbit tells of bridal veils woven with tiny fish bones for fertility, though most scholars agree that's either symbolic or deeply unhygienic. In either case, the ceremonies often included challenges. For example, lifting logs together, cutting wood as a couple, or solving riddles to prove compatibility. You don't just say, "I do." You demonstrate, "I physically can." Even the sleeping arrangements were weirdly collaborative. After the feast, the newlyweds might be escorted to the bridal bed by everyone. The whole village parades them in, sometimes singing, sometimes throwing grain. Occasionally, an elder would test the bed for creaking seriously and bless the union with a carved spoon or a bundle of twigs. Privacy, not a concept, comfort debatable. Scholars still debate whether these rites were rooted in ancient fertility cults or just thin excuses to throw community rages. Either way, if you survived the carrying, the crying, and the communal spoon ritual, you were considered ready for marriage. And if you dropped your bride in the bog, well, you'd better start practicing your public apology song. You're standing in front of a round loaf of bread the size of your head, trying not to look nervous. A room full of relatives is staring at you. And at this point, the bread is more popular than you are. This is medieval Russia, and this is your wedding. The loaf karavai is not just lunch, it's tradition. It's symbolism, and it might have more emotional depth than your actual relationship. The bread has been baked with sacred hands, often by women considered morally clean, a term that historically meant widowed, elderly, and above all, gossip-proof. It's decorated with salt, herbs, and occasionally small dough birds that symbolize peace, fertility, or, in some cases, the level of awkwardness your marriage is expected to endure. The bride and groom each tear off a chunk, and here's the kicker: whoever takes the bigger bite is said to be the head of the household. So if your new wife just unhinges her jaw like a bear at a picnic, don't take it personally. She's just setting the tone. And no, you may not use a knife. Biting is mandatory. It's a bread duel. The ceremony begins earlier that day with ritual washing, chanting, and more vodka than a midwinter funeral. The groom may have to endure a series of tests from the bride's family. Think of it as Slavic speed dating meets gladiator obstacle course. You're answering riddles, balancing on logs, and possibly getting mocked for your singing voice. And if you don't pass, you might have to pay a fine in silver coins or bottles of mead, which magically solves everything. One of the more theatrical traditions is the Vikup Nevesti, or bride ransom. You show up at her house, and her family demands gifts, poems, or increasingly humiliating dance moves to prove you're worthy. They might send out a fake bride in a veil, a cousin, or even a grandmother, and you have to pretend not to notice. Historians still argue whether this is symbolic of proving devotion or just an excuse to haze future in-laws with interpretive dance. Either way, everyone laughs. Except maybe you. The bride is then led out sometimes through a window, for reasons no one explains, and a torch-lit procession begins. People throw grain. There's loud music involving balalaikas, and somebody always brings a goat. You're lucky if you don't step on a chicken. One fringe account even describes grooms having to leap over fire to burn away bachelorhood, which works both literally and metaphorically if you trip once inside the wedding hall. There's a toasting marathon. Every toast is a performance. Every relative suddenly a poet. If you try to sip without someone shouting Gorko bitter, you're not doing it right. And when they do yell it, you're expected to kiss your bride to sweeten the moment. These chants can continue for hours. You may kiss so often, you begin to feel like a novelty act at a medieval kissing booth. And yes, there is group singing, lots of it. Songs about geese, harvests, tragic brides, and mischievous forest spirits who probably never married. One classic lyric translates roughly to "she left with the cow, but came back with twins," which is either a warning or a lifestyle choice. Scholars still debate whether these ceremonies were more about the marriage or the morale of the community. But one thing is clear, the bread mattered. If the loaf cracked, or was too salty, people whispered. If it fell, you'd have grandparents pulling out rosaries and someone blaming the weather and possibly your soul. So hold the loaf gently, bite with confidence, and for the love of all things fermented, chew before you smile. You're ankle deep in straw inside a stone barn in medieval France. and someone just handed you a pig. Not a metaphorical one, a literal snorting, pinkish-grey pig. Apparently, this is your dowry, or part of it. You'd think love might be the main ingredient in marriage, but here, it's cheese, livestock, and how well your new bride can churn butter. Welcome to the rural romance of 14th century French matrimony, where a successful wedding smells like brie and manure. The local priest squints at a parchment that may or may not be the actual contract. It's mostly numbers land plots, bushels of wheat, and units of cheese that will transfer ownership with the marriage. Somewhere in that long list is your bride, quietly adjusting her lace cap and trying not to roll her eyes. She's been traded like a highly desirable dairy product. And honestly, she knows her worth. Knows this wasn't unusual. Medieval French weddings were legal transactions before they were emotional events. Families negotiated marriage contracts down to the last goat. You didn't marry for love. You married for pasture rights. Historians still argue whether this pragmatism empowered women. Some could negotiate generous terms or left them bartered like fine camembert. And yes, cheese was a legitimate form of dowry. Wheels upon wheels of it. Some written records from Burgundy and Normandy list dowries entirely in dairy-aged goat cheese, soft sheep's milk rounds, and something ominously labeled fermented curd bricks. One fringe tidbit even claims a particularly pungent cheese once caused a delay in the wedding because the priest refused to officiate near it. We don't blame him. After the contracts were signed, the party began, and with it, a full buffet of mildly alarming traditions. One of the most bizarre, the charivari. Picture this. The groom and bride are asleep or pretending to be, and the entire village shows up outside their window banging pots, howling songs, and demanding they come out to dance. It's like a romantic flash mob orchestrated by your nosiest neighbors. If you didn't show up in your night clothes for at least one round of dancing, they'd just keep going. Until dawn. Inside the celebration, fertility rituals ran wild. People threw grain at the couple, not just as a symbol of prosperity, but also to check if they'd flinch. Brides were sometimes carried over thresholds, not to protect them from evil spirits, but to show they didn't trip easily. One particularly eyebrow-raising custom involved testing the bride's skill in domestic tasks. She might be asked to bake a loaf of bread mid-wedding, or demonstrate how to clean a hearth. Failure meant more teasing. Success meant her new mother-in-law might only criticize her once a day. The feast, naturally, centered around the dowry items: roast pig, fresh cheese, loaves stacked like towers, and more wine than was strictly necessary. Guests were ranked by seating arrangement, with the most important guests seated near the cheese, which is honestly how it should be. Toasts flowed endlessly, with each cousin trying to outdo the last in rhyming toasts and increasingly questionable ballads. And then came the bedding ceremony, or, more precisely, the public parade toward it. Unlike other cultures that left the newlyweds alone eventually, in parts of France, you'd be escorted with flutes, shouting, and often a small child carrying a candle far too close to the sheets. Sometimes they even tucked you in. Yes, tucked you in. Scholars still argue whether this invasive finale was a symbol of community bonding or just centuries of weaponized awkwardness. Either way, your private moment is now a communal event. Good luck sleeping with 3 farmers and a pig peeking through the curtain. Just remember, in medieval France, the wedding wasn't official until the cheese was shared. And that pig, legally speaking, it's family now. You're in a dimly lit room that smells of incense and anxiety. A silver blade gleams in the candlelight. And without much warning, someone starts cutting the bride's hair. Midnight has just struck, because of course it did, and you're beginning to suspect that this is not going to be one of those laid-back, easygoing weddings. This is medieval China, and things are about to get deeply symbolic, possibly astrological, and slightly haunted. The haircut is not a fashion choice. It's ritual. The bride's hair, once a symbol of her maidenhood, is now divided and combed into a new style. 1 braid into 2, marking her transformation from daughter to wife. There's a belief that cutting the hair at exactly the right hour, often chosen by a diviner who definitely has no chill, can influence the fate of the entire marriage. Historians still argue whether this ritual was rooted in Confucian doctrine or tangled up with regional ancestor cults. Either way, miss the timing, and you might as well postpone the wedding, or the next decade. You sit awkwardly as a line of family members performs offerings to heaven, earth, ancestors, and anyone else who might be spiritually eavesdropping. In some cases, a rooster is involved, either as a substitute groom, yes, really, or a witness to the vow. Depending on which province you're in and how confusing your day is becoming. One quirky tradition known from the Tang dynasty involves brides being wed to deceased grooms to complete their destiny, a ghost marriage. If your fiancé died unexpectedly, tough luck, the wedding might still go on, complete with a dummy groom or a portrait on a chair. That chair very married now. Ghost marriages weren't rare, especially among elite families. They were seen as a way to honor commitments and avoid social shame. You might be thinking, that's a bit dramatic. But think of it as the medieval version of, we've already paid the caterer. The bride would move in with the groom's family, live like a widow, and sometimes even raise adopted children in his name. Romance not exactly, but spiritually efficient. Very. Once you've wrapped your head around spectral in-laws, you attend the tea ceremony, which is exactly as intense as it sounds. The couple kneels before parents, elders, and occasionally entire towns, offering tea in a specific order with unbreakable etiquette. Every move is watched. Spill the tea. Bad omen. Forget a bow, social disaster. The cups themselves are sometimes painted with phoenixes and dragons, symbolizing yin and yang. But don't let the pretty art distract you. Someone's definitely judging your grip strength. Gifts follow, but not just gold and jade, sometimes chickens, bolts of silk, or wooden ducks carved in pairs. These ducks, forever loyal to one partner, symbolize marital harmony. Unless one falls over, in which case someone's aunt is definitely going to gasp dramatically and suggest postponing everything. There's also a moment where the bride is fed sweet dumplings in syrup to ensure a sweet life, which sounds lovely until you learn the dumplings are hot, sticky, and nearly impossible to eat gracefully in full ceremonial robes. And then there's the bed setup. But unlike the communal madness of France, here it's a quiet spiritual ritual, though no less strange. A boy, preferably born in the year of the dragon, is asked to jump on the marriage bed to bless fertility. Sometimes a fortune teller sprinkles red dates and lotus seeds on the sheets while muttering words that sound like incantations but might just be tax advice. Either way, the energy is serious. Scholars still debate whether these wedding elements evolved from strict Confucian family codes or a collage of older Taoist and folk customs. Probably both. Definitely complex. You're finally allowed to breathe when the doors close, and the bride, now veiled in red silk, sits beside her new husband, who has yet to say more than 5 words. But don't get too comfortable, because one of the ancestral offerings just moved. You're surrounded by velvet banners, the scent of polished steel, and the awkward silence that comes with marrying someone who may or may not have caused a war. Welcome to the Holy Roman Empire, where weddings aren't just unions, they're treaties in fancy outfits. The bride, veiled like a diplomatic secret, stands beside the groom, who's wearing a sword that's probably ceremonial but just sharp enough to make a point. This is not a wedding. This is a soft coup in formal wear. From Bavaria to Bohemia, noble weddings served as the original power lunches, except with more incense and a slightly higher risk of poisoning. Marriage sealed alliances, secured inheritances, and occasionally solved disputes that couldn't be handled by a siege. One 13th century duke famously married off 4 daughters in 1 week to prevent civil war, an impressive feat. Though historians still argue whether it was strategic genius or sheer desperation disguised as celebration. The ceremony begins with a parade that makes modern red carpets look underwhelming. Horses, trumpets, a small army of cousins, all marching through mud like it's part of the choreography. The bride rides side saddle, barely able to breathe in a gown that weighs more than most of her political agency. She doesn't speak. That's not a metaphor. She literally isn't allowed to say anything until the priest says her name. Her voice, it's property now. But first, the veil snatch. You'd think lifting a bride's veil would be a sweet gesture, maybe even romantic. Not here. In many Central European regions, the moment the couple entered the bridal chamber, a group of women, usually older, wiser, and terrifying, would dramatically tear the bride's veil from her head. Symbolically, this represented her leaving behind maidenhood and entering womanhood. Realistically, it was more like a mid-level mugging in lace. One fringe account from 1292 tells of a veil so stubborn it required 3 maids and a small knife. The bride laughed, the groom fainted. Meanwhile, money changed hands. Coins were tossed into the air, scattered among guests, or ceremoniously placed in the bride's shoe, which seems romantic until you realize she now has to limp through the rest of the procession with 5 silver groats under her heel. Sometimes the groom would try to impress his new in-laws by showering guests with coin, which sounds generous until someone nearly loses an eye. Historians still argue whether this was meant to show prosperity or just a medieval version of making it rain. Now to the vow-taking. In the early Holy Roman tradition, this was often done in Latin, which neither the bride nor the groom usually understood. A priest, or more accurately, a designated speaker, would translate it roughly. Do you agree to this extremely binding agreement involving land, livestock, and the occasional awkward cousin? The couple would nod. Smiling was optional. Eye contact risky. Then came the ring hand switch. Today we're used to rings on the left. But in parts of the empire, rings moved from right to left hands depending on regional politics, church edicts, or whether Mercury was in retrograde. One bishop's decree in 1197 caused half a province to switch hands mid-ceremony. Weddings paused, guests panicked. One groom had to bite his own finger to get the ring off. Romantic, no. Memorable, very. Feasts followed, long tables, boar on a spit, and speeches that never ended. Someone always got drunk and challenged a cousin to a duel in honor of the bride's ankles. The new couple sat beneath a canopy held by 4 unmarried knights, symbolizing protection. Or perhaps just making sure no one ran away. By the time the wedding night arrived, the couple had barely spoken. But they were technically united. Land had been exchanged, banners raised, veils torn, coins counted, love optional, legacy mandatory. You're standing in a rain-slicked Scottish glen, holding a log that's roughly the size of your dignity, which is to say very heavy and slightly splintered. This is not a lumberjack competition. This is your wedding trial. Welcome to medieval Scotland and Ireland, where love is tested by lifting things, tossing things, and on certain occasions losing teeth, not metaphorically, literally. The log, often called the carrying of the beam, is your first challenge. You're expected to lift it across a specific distance without dropping it, tripping, or swearing in front of your future in-laws. It's supposed to symbolize your ability to shoulder responsibility, provide for your household, and, let's be honest, not collapse under pressure. Historians still argue whether this test has roots in pagan fertility rites or was just an elaborate prank created by the bride's uncle Fergus. Next up, the tooth tossing. It sounds worse than it is barely. In certain remote Irish clans, particularly those near Connaught, a groom might voluntarily offer up a baby tooth or occasionally a molar into the hearth fire. The act was believed to sacrifice boyhood in exchange for manhood, with the ashes swept beneath the marriage bed. One fringe account suggests the bride's family would collect the tooth and place it in a woven charm bag, meant to ensure loyalty. Romantic if your definition of romance includes dental trauma. Absolutely. Once your jaw stops aching, you're invited inside a smoky hall where guests are already halfway through the mead and fully through the gossip. In the Celtic world, a wedding was a communal happening. Everyone participated, everyone judged. From the food oatcakes and boiled mutton to the fashion wool cloaks and ceremonial knives. This wasn't just a party. It was a performance review with bagpipes. You and your bride are seated on a raised platform like medieval prom royalty. And now comes the most dreaded rite of all, the blanket test. Here's how it works. An elder, often a grandmother with terrifying accuracy, feels the wedding bed the next morning for signs of activity. Wrinkles, crumbs, and suspicious warmth are all taken into account. If the bed's cold and clean, you may be in trouble. If it's warm, but the blanket is oddly tidy, someone might call for a do-over. Historians still argue whether this was an honest fertility test or just one last power move by the matriarchs to prove they ran everything, including the honeymoon. During the feast, toasts are offered in the form of riddles and rhyming insults. Your ability to respond cleverly reflects on your readiness for married life. One classic line goes, "He who cannot churn nor cheer shall neither herd nor hold her near." Translation: if you can't make butter or small talk, you don't deserve your wife. The guests roar with laughter. You silently wonder if the pig from France would have been a less judgmental wedding guest. The bride, dressed in dyed linen, may wear a wreath of rowan berries to ward off fey interference. Someone always brings up the cousin who ran off with a kelpie. No one questions it. The supernatural is very much on the guest list. You eat, drink, sing old Gaelic ballads, and occasionally participate in a weird game involving antlers. It's better not to ask. As night falls, your blanket is inspected one final time, usually by a group of giggling children and one deadly serious druid who smells like peat smoke and judgment. There's clapping, there's grain throwing. There's probably too much information being shared by your new aunt. Scholars still debate whether this Celtic chaos was about fertility, honor, or just small communities making sure no one slacked off. Either way, marriage here is an achievement unlocked. You've carried wood, sacrificed enamel, and passed a very public sleep study. You may now chew cautiously and kiss the bride with whatever teeth remain. You're seated at a stone table under an olive tree. It's twilight. The air is warm, and the only sound is the flickering of oil lamps and the soft shuffle of people placing plates before. No one. The table is set, the food is exquisite, but there are no living guests. This is a wedding feast for the dead. Welcome to Southern Europe in the late Middle Ages, where eternal love isn't just poetic, it's a legally binding agreement that might involve your ancestors watching. Closely, in parts of medieval Italy and Spain, wedding ceremonies often blurred the lines between the sacred and the supernatural, while the rest of the world celebrated with raucous dancing and rustic pigs. Here, the ceremony might open with a moment of silence for the bride's grandmother and end with that same grandmother receiving a dedicated seat at the table. And not figuratively. A chair, a plate, a napkin, sometimes even a glass of wine offered to someone who had passed decades ago. Historians still argue whether this was a blend of Catholic doctrine and lingering pagan rites, or just Southern Europe doing emotional overachievement at an elite level. One key tradition, the anillo escondido, the hidden ring. In some regions, the ring wasn't presented during the ceremony at all. Instead, it was buried beneath the threshold of the couple's new home, meant to anchor their union to the earth and to their ancestors. Before stepping inside together, they would kneel, scoop a bit of soil, and whisper a vow that no one else heard. You don't put the ring on her finger, you bury it and then walk across it. Romantic. In a medievally poetic way that also invites blisters and at least one splinter. The wedding procession through town often included stops at multiple shrines and family graves, where the couple would light candles and recite vows again this time for the benefit of those long gone. One fringe account from Valencia in 1471 describes a bride who spoke her vow to a carved statue of her great-grandmother, whose skeletal remains had been placed in the chapel crypt specifically to bear witness. Skeptical, yes, but oddly, it was seen as a sacred privilege. Grandma was the original notary public. The feast, when it finally begins, is stunning. Roasted figs, marzipan shaped like doves, and a wedding bread baked with coins inside. But again, many dishes are offered to the spirits first. The couple touches nothing until symbolic portions have been placed before the empty chairs. If the wine vanishes in the cup evaporation or not, it's considered a powerful omen. Sometimes terrifying, sometimes thrilling, always noted. Even the music has ghosts. Flamenco in its early forms, or older folk chants sung in minor keys. Carry tones meant to draw the spirits near. The rhythm pulls everyone in, whether they have a pulse or not. The bride might be wearing orange blossoms in her hair, a symbol of purity and fertility. But there could also be a black ribbon woven discreetly beneath, a nod to family members lost but not forgotten. And if that weren't enough to overload your senses, some Spanish traditions included a muerte blanca, white death ritual, where the bride symbolically died to her old life and was reborn as a wife. This involved white shrouds, candle-lit circles, and at least one person whispering blessings in Latin who may or may not be fully qualified to do so. Scholars continue to debate whether these rites were an extension of ancestor veneration or simply a way to process loss in a society that rarely got closure. Either way, it made weddings feel like ceremonies that stretched across generations, binding not just the couple, but the family, the lineage, and the land itself. And now, as the stars appear above the vineyard and the wine softens the edges of everything, you lean back. The guests are laughing, the dead are remembered, and the bride gently places her hand over yours. There is no rush. The food will keep. The past is here, the future is unfolding, and the ghosts, for now, are smiling. And so, with torches burned low and laughter echoing like a lullaby through 1,000 years, you find yourself drifting from fields and feasts into a gentler place. The shoes have been stolen, the pigs exchanged, the ghosts fed. You've trudged through snowdrifts, carried brides like logs, kissed over bitter bread, and whispered vows to ancestors and animals alike. Your feet are sore, your eyes are heavy, and somewhere in the distance, someone is still chanting a wedding song that refuses to end. But you dear guest of so many strange unions, you can finally rest. Let the incense fade. Let the bread cool. Let the veil fall like silk into sleep. These bizarre weddings, with all their chaos and beauty, are safely tucked into the past. And now, so are you. Sleep well. Now, we enter a marble dining room lit by oil lamps and the distant flicker of moral decay. A Roman triclinium where guests recline on couches and pretend fermented fish guts are the peak of human civilization. Bronze trays clink as slaves carry in dishes that hiss, steam, and sometimes still twitch. You would never think that dinner could smell like a fishing dock left in the sun for 3 weeks, but here we are. And someone just called it divine. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I want to see who's snacking through ancient horror. You take a breath and instantly regret it. That nose-burning scent that's garum, the king of Roman condiments, brewed from fermented fish left to rot in giant vats under the sun. It's poured over everything: bread, lentils, meat, even fruit. The rich slather it on like ranch dressing from hell. Aged anchovies, salt, thyme, and heat truly, the 4 horsemen of ancient flavor. And yet, it's wildly popular. Some historians compare it to soy sauce in its ubiquity. Others compare it to a biological hazard. You recline next to a senator who's swirling garum into his wine. He offers you a sip. You politely decline and choose to live. The main course is flamingo tongue. Yes, flamingo, a delicacy reserved for those who need everyone in the room to know they are richer than you. The tongue is supposedly tender, with a flavor that melts like fatty duck. Which makes sense, since it's basically just flamboyant waterfowl muscle. There are also peacock brains, parrot heads, and occasionally stuffed ostrich. Because why not turn dinner into an exotic pet funeral? You nibble cautiously while someone brags about importing snow from the Alps just to chill their wine. It's not about taste, it's about flexing. Wealthy Romans curated their meals to prove they had conquered both land and logic. Why eat something practical when you can eat something endangered? A fringe tidbit buried in the satirical writing of Petronius describes a banquet where each course represented a zodiac sign, including edible scorpions for Scorpio and honey-glazed ram testicles for Aries. No one asked for that, but it happened, and probably more than once. Historians still argue whether garum was actually considered delicious by the average Roman or simply tolerated because social climbing smells worse than it tastes. Some scholars insist it had a complex umami flavor. Others think it was just liquefied peer pressure. And yet, you have to admit, the Romans went all in. They turned decay into cuisine, flamboyance into flavor, and dinner into theater. This wasn't food. It was status, survival, and a little bit of self-destruction, sprinkled with myrtle and served on silver. You're not full. You're just overwhelmed. And the second course hasn't even squeaked yet. You lift the ornate silver lid, bracing for something roasted, maybe glazed, perhaps gently simmered instead. You meet the glassy stare of a small, pudgy rodent, perfectly browned, slightly stuffed, and inexplicably luxurious. It's a dormouse. And no, you are not hallucinating. You're at a Roman banquet, and this tiny mammal, usually associated with woodland cuteness and bedtime stories, is tonight's haute cuisine. Don't let the size fool you. Dormice were delicacies. Romans bred them in specialized clay jars called glyraria, adorably sinister hamster condos, designed to keep the creatures warm, sleepy, and perpetually overfed. They were fattened with acorns and chestnuts, then taken out, stuffed with seasoned minced pork or pine nuts, rolled in honey and poppy seeds, and baked until they resembled festive meatballs with whiskers. The smell sweet, savory, slightly herbal, and very hard to explain to your modern stomach. You stare at the dormouse, and it stares back, albeit without the burden of being alive. You chew. The meat is soft, oily, and faintly nutty, with a glaze that clings to your fingers like guilt. One noble woman to your left loudly praises the dish's refined crunch, while someone across the room starts a heated debate about cinnamon imports from India. Because yes, this is not just food, this is a geopolitical showcase. Historians still argue whether dormouse dishes were truly common or only appeared at the most elite. Absurdly wealthy tables. Some say they were only served during Saturnalia or imperial visits. Others suggest their popularity was widespread enough to merit farming manuals. What's certain is that nobody raised dormice for companionship. You try to wash it down with some diluted wine flavored with herbs mint, bay leaf, and something that might be oregano or regret. The server asks if you want a second dormouse. You say no. He brings you one anyway. That's hospitality. Here's a fringe detail: some hosts painted the dormice gold, not the dish, the actual rodents. Just a light gilding, to impress guests and perhaps confuse future archaeologists. Because when in doubt, coat the weirdness in precious metal. And if you think this is the weirdest dish of the night, think again. The dormouse is just the appetizer, a warm-up act. It's the ancient Roman equivalent of nachos if nachos were rodents, seasoned with swine and placed next to garum fountains. You glance around the room. Guests are reclining like theatrical corpses, picking through their tiny glazed prey with toothpicks made from ivory or porcupine quills. Conversation flows, jokes about senators' waistlines, a loud toast to Bacchus. Someone starts humming. It's surreal, but under the absurdity. The message is clear: we eat this because we can. It's about domination of nature, of appetite, of logic. Why eat bread when you can eat something that needed a private jar and a 5-step fattening plan? You dab your lips. You breathe out honey and mouse fat. You smile politely, because dessert is probably going to involve something that still has teeth. You're leaning back, trying to digest your glazed rodent experience, when a server places a silver platter before you with the ominous confidence of someone who knows what's coming. It jiggles. That's your first warning. The second is the smell, a mix of boiled meat and overcommitment. Congratulations. Tonight's delicacy is a cow's udder. Boiled, spiced, and served cold enough to make you question your life choices. You prod it with your fork. It yields slightly, like old pudding that went to gladiator school. The texture is somewhere between a damp sponge and anxiety. But in elite Roman circles, this dish was peak luxury. Calf udders, especially those from young, non-lactating animals, were prized for their tenderness if not their taste. According to Apicius, the original Roman cookbook author and probable culinary thrill-seeker, it should be boiled, seasoned with lovage and pepper, and then served as a centerpiece. Nothing says romance like cow mammary gland with a drizzle of oil. Across the table, a senator is cutting into his like it's roast duck. You follow suit, because politeness is more binding than self-preservation. The first bite is interesting, slightly creamy, very chewy, and deeply confusing. Your mouth doesn't know whether to swallow or file a complaint. You opt for a sip of wine. Unfortunately, it's mulsum, a syrupy blend of wine and honey, which only makes things worse. And then the sausages arrive. Not just any sausages. Lucanicky thick, fatty coils packed with minced pork, crushed pine nuts, pepper, and a generous helping of blood. They're sizzling in sheep fat. And if you close your eyes and ignore the blood content, they almost smell like breakfast. Except, more gladiatorial. These sausages were popular across the empire, even exported. In fact, they were named after the region of Lucania, because naming meat after where it was harvested makes it sound fancier than intestine balloon. One quirky recipe from Apicius includes a stuffed sow's womb, seasoned and sewn shut like a meaty purse. It was often parboiled, roasted, and then sliced thin at banquets. Scholars still debate whether these off-cut dishes were ways to honor the whole animal or just an early example of competitive weirdness. Romans believed in nose-to-tail dining before it was cool or ethical, or arguably edible. You push the sausage around your plate as someone across the room waxes poetic about spleen stew. Another guest chimes in about jellied calf's brains. You smile, you nod. You consider moving to Gaul and becoming a vegetarian. Unfortunately, vegetables are also served pickled in fish sauce and occasionally dyed purple with crushed mollusks. Historians still argue whether these culinary adventures were born from economic thrift, superstition, or simply the urge to keep dinner guests guessing. Some say the elite simply wanted what the poor would never touch. Others think they genuinely enjoyed the sensory madness. One thing is clear, the Roman palate prized surprise. And tonight, the surprise is that you're still chewing something with the texture of uncooked socks. But don't worry, dessert is next, and it might blink. You crouch near the embers of a stone hearth, the smoke curling like incense. Except what's roasting over the fire isn't a lamb or a pigeon, it's a cluster of fat, glistening worms, maguey worms. To be precise, they're skewered and crackling, their insides caramelizing, just enough to make you wonder if dinner is about to fight back. This is an Aztec feast, and insects aren't the backup plan. They're the main course. Protein-rich, full of flavor, and depending on who you ask, deeply sacred or deeply crunchy. You pop one into your mouth. The outer skin gives way with a polite snap, and the inside is buttery. Not French croissant buttery, more earthy backyard surprise buttery. You chew, you swallow, you don't cry. That's considered rude. These worms were harvested from agave plants, pulled with wooden tools, and carefully selected for size and girth. Served toasted or fried, they were prized for both their taste and their spiritual significance. The maguey plant itself was considered a gift from the gods used for food, drink, clothing, and apparently bug buffets. Historians still argue whether the inclusion of insects in Aztec cuisine was more ritualistic than nutritional, but either way, you're being watched approvingly by a grandmother who has at least 4 bugs on her plate and 0 hesitation. Next comes the ant eggs, called escamoles. These pale, pearl-like morsels are the caviar of ancient Mesoamerica, collected from the roots of agave or cactus. They were sautéed with herbs and served in tortillas, where they oozed a creamy, nutty texture that's best described as alarmingly smooth. The first bite is unexpectedly mild. The second bite makes you question whether you like it, or if your brain has simply given up. Nearby, a group of elders passes around a dish of ahuahutl, also known as waterbug caviar. Harvested from lake foam, these tiny eggs were sun-dried, ground, and used in tamales or cakes. One fringe tidbit claims that priests ate them before important rituals to purify the body, which is a very poetic way of saying bug cleanse. They're slightly salty, oddly satisfying, and depending on the seasoning, suspiciously like popcorn if popcorn were laid by aquatic insects and blessed by the sun. You don't even flinch now as a child hands you a toasted grasshopper. It's spicy, crunchy, surprisingly decent. The Aztecs knew how to season their food with local chili, lime, and crushed cacao, which turns almost anything into a snack, even things with 6 legs and antennae. It's not just about taste, it's about balance. These insects provided vital nutrients, protein, fat, calcium, in a world where large livestock were rare. The Aztecs didn't waste effort on giant feasts full of beef. They perfected miniature, sustainable cuisine long before the term eco-friendly existed. Some historians even argue that this was an advanced agricultural model, low impact, high reward, and weirdly delicious if you get past the legs. You wipe your fingers on a woven cloth, and someone offers you seconds. This time it's a skewer of tiny roasted lizards. You take one, you smile, you crunch. Because in this world, you don't eat the bugs. The bugs eat you if you hesitate. You lift a clay cup to your lips, expecting something warm, comforting, maybe even sweet. What you get is thick, bitter, and spicy enough to wake your ancestors. This isn't your cafe's hot chocolate. This is zocolotl, the sacred drink of the Aztecs, made from roasted cacao beans, chili, and water whipped into a frothy, dark potion. It coats your tongue like spiced mud and settles in your stomach like it came with warnings. You would never think a beverage could feel confrontational. And yet, here we are. This is not dessert. This is medicine. Ceremony. Maybe both. You sip again, and it bites back rich with chili, sometimes thickened with cornmeal, sometimes enhanced with other ingredients you probably shouldn't ask about. In elite rituals, zocolotl was used in sacred rites and royal ceremonies, offered to warriors, nobles, and occasionally gods. It was less of a treat and more of a resume booster for your soul. There's a low chant building around you. A priest is preparing something ceremonial near the temple steps. The chocolate you're drinking may include more than just beans and peppers. Fringe reports rare, whispered, almost superstitious suggest that, in specific rites, Aztec priests would mix symbolic substances into the zocolotl bone ash, crushed obsidian, or even tiny amounts of human remains from honored sacrifices. Just enough to fuse spirit and earth, as one ancient inscription euphemistically put it. Historians still argue whether these ingredients were literal or metaphorical, but no one wants to be the one to find out by accident. One scholar speculates that drinking this concoction during rituals was a form of communion with ancestors and gods, turning the body into a vessel of divine energy. You speculate whether that bitter aftertaste is just the chili or something more spiritual, more unsettling. Nearby, warriors prepare for a feast. They dip small maize cakes into chocolate thickened with blood orange and chili, while others swirl crushed cacao with tionanacatl, the divine mushroom, though that's more of a vision quest than a dinner course. Everything is purposefully intense. Even leisure tastes like trial by fire, one elder explains in low tones. That cacao was once currency. 100 beans could buy you a turkey. 1,000 could bribe a priest. And tonight, your humble clay cup might be worth more than a day's wages, especially if it contains anything extra. You take another sip. The heat floods your chest. There's something grounding about it, almost addictive. You see why warriors drank this before battle, why nobles sipped it during strategy councils, and why emperors hoarded beans like divine treasures. Montezuma, it said, drank over 50 cups a day, which explains both the energy and the absolute terror radiating from his portraits. This isn't comfort food, it's endurance in liquid form, a test, a ritual, a punch in the throat, followed by a hug from the cosmos. You set the cup down, your lips are tingling, and the priest is still watching you. You're handed a bowl of steaming tamale stew, fragrant with chili, squash blossom, and just the faintest hint of existential dread. Around you, the fire crackles, and a ceremonial drum thumps slow and steady like a heartbeat. Or a countdown. Everyone else is already eating. You're the last to dig in, and people are watching, smiling, waiting. This isn't a normal meal. This is post-sacrifice dining in the Aztec Empire. And the meat in your bowl may have come with a soul attached. You swallow hard, not from fear, okay? Maybe a little from fear, but because this is one of the most debated topics in pre-Columbian archaeology, ritual cannibalism. Some sources, including first-hand Spanish accounts and carved codices, claim that after certain sacrificial ceremonies, small parts of the honored dead, usually warriors captured in battle, were cooked and consumed, not for sustenance, but for symbolism. You don't eat out of hunger. You eat to honor the gods. At least, that's the party line. The stew smells good. That's the disturbing part. Spicy, rich, almost too rich. You try not to think about what meat normally tastes like, and what this one doesn't. One fringe account from a stunned conquistador describes meat from ritual dishes as being like pork, but darker with a bitter heat. Not exactly a Yelp review, but enough to keep you chewing slowly. Historians still argue whether these accounts were exaggerations, mistranslations, or deliberate demonizations by European chroniclers. Some suggest the Spanish, shocked by Aztec ritual complexity, saw what they feared or wanted others to fear. Others say archaeological evidence supports some form of ceremonial consumption, especially in state-sponsored festivals where human remains were found in cooking pits. The truth is probably complicated, buried somewhere between reverence and survival. You sip a maize drink thickened with cacao and chili to clear your palate, but the taste lingers. Not the meat, the meaning. Eating someone wasn't about removing them. It was about absorbing them. Valor, energy, divine favor transferred bite by bite. You become a little bit godlike, or a little bit haunted. No one speaks as they eat. It's part of the ritual. A silent reflection on life, death, and the uneasy line between gratitude and horror. The priest stands nearby, holding a feathered staff and watching the flames. The ashes swirl up toward the stars. And this wasn't everyday behavior. Contrary to popular belief, the Aztecs didn't casually throw barbecues every time someone annoyed them. These feasts were rare, bound by strict religious calendars and codes of conduct. Often, the body was treated with the highest ceremonial honor, bathed, painted, draped in finery, then returned to the community in symbolic form. You weren't just eating flesh. You were participating in a sacred echo of cosmological balance. Of course, some scholars point out that this ritual may have doubled as a deeply practical way to deal with excess protein during times of feast and famine. But no one says that out loud here. You scrape the last bit from the bowl, it's good. Uncomfortably good. The spices numb your lips. The heat settles in your chest. And you're pretty sure that somewhere, someone's spirit is quietly nodding approval, or watching from the steam. You're back in Rome now, reclining under a ceiling painted with cherubs and ceiling leaks, staring at a dish that looks alive. It isn't, technically, but sea urchin spleens do a remarkable job pretending they have plans of their own. You cautiously lower your spoon into a bowl of golden orange goo that glistens like regret and smells like the wrong side of the ocean. This, apparently, is what fine dining looks like when taste and texture part ways and file for divorce. The Romans prized this bizarre delicacy. Sea urchin organs, spleens, gonads, whatever's soft and scoopable, were whisked into creamy sauces or served raw on vinegar-drenched toast. You swallow a bite, and the texture slides across your tongue like a sea-flavored pudding that didn't sign off on being food. The elite swore by its aphrodisiac properties, because nothing says romance like slurping mollusk goop in a room full of senators. Across the table, someone enthusiastically stabs into a dish of goat brain boiled, mashed, and folded with cumin, mint, and vinegar. It's spread across bread like a thick, grey butter. You smile politely and pretend you didn't just gag a little inside your soul. According to Apicius, this was a staple at high-status feasts. The more organs, the more prestige. One fringe anecdote even suggests that Emperor Elagabalus once hosted an entire banquet of nothing but tongues, brains, and spinal marrow because apparently texture was more important than digestion. Historians still argue whether Romans truly liked this food, or whether they simply valued the statement it made, "I can afford to eat the parts no one else dares to touch." Eating spleen wasn't about taste, it was about being seen. The more exotic, squishy, or structurally confusing your meal was, the more elite you were. Culinary clout, ancient edition. Even the fish dishes aren't safe. Eels served grilled, pickled, or so fresh they occasionally slide across platters like haunted spaghetti. You watch as a nobleman plucks one up with a golden fork, dips it in honey, and praises the balance of sweetness and sorrow. No one questions it. This is Rome. The weirder the food, the deeper the soul. Then comes the jellied sow's feet, yes. The feet, boiled until soft, deboned, pressed into molds with vinegar and herbs, then chilled into a translucent dome of confusion. It wobbles when touched, it jiggles when breathed on. You stare at it, and it seems to stare back. One bite in, and it's clear this is less about nourishment and more about proving you won't blink. And let's not forget the oysters served raw, sometimes topped with garum for that extra punch of fish-flavored fermentation. You slurp one down. It's cold, slick, and vaguely defiant. It feels less like eating and more like survival wrapped in marble opulence. Scholars still argue whether this obsession with slippery, mushy textures had roots in medical theory, perhaps linked to ancient ideas about humors and bodily balance, or if it was simply a case of elite Romans trying to out-weird each other before dessert. Either way, the pattern holds chewy, slimy, and not even pretending to be approachable. You lean back. You've eaten sea creatures that never deserved this fate. Brains that belonged in heads and organs that frankly shouldn't be named at the dinner table. But you survived, barely, and next. You'll visit a city where grilled lizards are considered light snacking. You're walking through the heart of Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital. And the marketplace is alive, really alive. Not metaphorically. Something in that basket just blinked. Welcome to the Tianguis, the open-air market where commerce meets chaos. And the air is thick with incense, spice, and frog legs. Everything here is edible, but not necessarily reassuring. You pass pyramids of chilies, piles of maize, and next to them grilled lizards on sticks, roasted salamanders, and what looks suspiciously like a frog kebab. You pause, you stare, you continue. Food stalls crowd every path, vendors barking offers like auctioneers who've just discovered how enthusiastic people get over fire-roasted insects. One woman scoops axolotls, yes, those smiling, frilly-gilled amphibians onto a flat stone, slathers them in sauce, and wraps them in tortillas. They're delicacies, she tells you, high in protein, surprisingly tender, and possibly judging you from the afterlife. There's also chapulines, spicy grasshoppers toasted with lime and salt, sold in small woven baskets like trail mix from a parallel universe. You try one. Crunchy, tangy, not bad if you pretend it's popcorn with legs. Kids eat them like candy, tossing them in the air and catching them in their mouths. You're not sure if you're impressed or quietly traumatized. You move on to see frogs with crisped skin, stacked like edible origami. salamanders, deep-fried and arranged like floral bouquets, roasted snakes curled elegantly around corn cakes. The presentation is top tier. The contents, less so. One fringe account mentions Tionana cattle flesh of the gods sold in dried bundles beside the mushrooms and fermented drinks. A hallucinogenic treat, not technically food, but definitely snack adjacent. Some historians argue it was consumed for religious trances. Others believe it was part of elite banquets where consciousness expansion was paired with spicy stew. Either way, you decline. The smell of roasted maize mingles with something vaguely swampy as you pass a row of stalls offering tamales stuffed with everything from turkey to tadpoles. Crunchy ones, wrapped in banana leaves. They look harmless. You try one, it's earthy, a little salty. And now you know what it's like to eat a rain puddle. Historians still argue whether the Aztec diet was primarily utilitarian, or whether the culinary variety was a statement of cultural sophistication. With livestock scarce, amphibians and insects filled the protein gap efficient, renewable, and abundant. But these weren't just survival snacks. They were seasoned, stylized, and deeply woven into tradition. Food wasn't just eaten, it was displayed, bartered, offered, and occasionally worshipped. The market bustles around you, a living organism of smells, sounds, and sizzling things that leap off grills. You spot a boy selling roasted beetles on tiny skewers. A girl hands her mother a handful of escamoles and larvae for dinner. It's normalized, it's vibrant, it's surprisingly beautiful. And just when you think you've adjusted, someone offers you a sip of fermented corn beer laced with chili and cacao. It tastes like molten corn syrup with a personal vendetta. You smile, you nod, and you wonder if ancient food ever came with warning labels. Probably not. But it definitely came with legs. You're lying on a Roman couch again, stomach stretched, eyelids heavy. And you're pretty sure your last coherent thought was, I shouldn't have eaten that jellyfish. But just as you think it's time to rest, someone claps, and a servant brings out what can only be described as more food. Roasted thrushes, stuffed figs, honeyed snails. It's the fourth course of the third meal today. And you are not done. You're being tested. This is the finale of Roman overindulgence, where the meal doesn't end when you're full, it ends when you tap out. Emotionally and spiritually. You've heard the term vomitorium tossed around, mythically framed as rooms built for elegant, controlled purging between courses, while historians now agree that vomitoria were actually architectural exits, not marble-tiled purge palaces. That doesn't mean the practice of induced vomiting was fictional. On the contrary, elite Romans were known to use feathers, herbs, or gentle walks to reset the stomach and start again. Because when gluttony becomes a sport, digestion is merely a timeout. Someone passes you posca, a mix of vinegar and water meant to ease your belly. It doesn't. Then comes wine infused with myrrh, which tastes like someone stirred regret into cough syrup. And yet, this final round isn't about food. It's about proving you can handle the absurdity of it all. Across the empire, leftovers are lavish and abundant. Slaves package them into bundles for poorer citizens or temple offerings. Bones are boiled into medicinal broths, skins turned into chewable snacks. Even dessert scraps like dates stuffed with pine nuts are recycled into breakfast pastries. In the Aztec world, a similar respect for food balance exists, but with a slightly more spiritual undertone. Nothing goes to waste if it can feed the body or the gods. In certain Aztec temples, bones from honored ancestors were boiled to create ceremonial broth. The steam was thought to carry messages upward to the sky, to the sun, to the realm where warriors dance forever. One fringe tale tells of a feast where the bones of sacrificial captives were ground and stirred into maize dough, forming tamales offered to deities. Scholars still argue whether this was literal ritual or poetic metaphor, but the symbolism is as thick as the broth. Back in Rome, someone leans over and offers you stuffed sea slug, served cold with mint. You decline, firmly, because this time, you're not pretending. The lights dim, the laughter fades. Servants begin collecting trays, scraping off honey, blood, and powdered cinnamon into clay bins. Someone reads bad poetry about the fleeting sweetness of figs. You don't clap, you just breathe. And for the first time all evening, you feel something like peace. Even disgust has its rhythm. It builds, it bursts, and eventually, it fades into numb acceptance. You close your eyes. You let the strange textures and sacred sources fade into memory. And now, the final course is sleep. The fire crackles lower. The platters are gone. The roasted bugs and fermented fish, the jelly bones and sacred drinks, they've all settled into the quiet hum of history. Your stomach groans once, then sighs. The torches flicker like distant stars, and a slow, gentle stillness drapes across your senses. You're no longer chewing, you're floating. And whether it was honeyed mouse or cocoa with questions, you feasted with ghosts tonight. Sleep now, the past is full, and so are you.